The Detroit Red Wings are off to a good start, surprising a lot of people, and they recently ended a 2-game losing streak. Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings is here to talk about Detroit's start to the season and what the keys are for their success long term. We've got all that and a lot more coming up on this episode of the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome back to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. Gil Martin, so glad you could join us today. And thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Red Wings, Brian Fisher. And Brian, big win for Detroit over the weekend. Why was this win over Minnesota so important to the Red Wings this early part of the season?
Well, because it proved that they can beat teams that are expected to be at least playoff caliber teams. The team got out to a hot start. They were 3-0-2 before facing a real bona fide contender in Boston Bruins. One of their overtime losses was to the Los Angeles Kings, and they stole that point off of a great play from Dylan Larkin. So they had yet to beat a team that was expected to be a playoff team. And they lost big to the New Jersey Devils, 5-2. And the New Jersey Devils had great underlying numbers that had finally came to a head against a bad game from Detroit. Boston came into town. They committed 7 penalties. And the Bruins, with Marchand back, is not going to let that slide. They scored 3 power play goals. But Derek Lalonde went back to Ville Husso for the first time this season. He's gone back to the same goalie in back-to-back games, trusting that that game against Boston was because they took a lot of penalties and not because of a poor performance. And he was rewarded. Ville Husso stopped 30 shots of 31 against the Minnesota Wild, just allowing 1 goal. And I understand the Minnesota Wild are off to a little bit of a slow start. I believe now they are 3-5 after the loss to the Detroit Red Wings, but they're a team I expect to make the playoffs, especially with a guy like Kirill Kaprizov, who can shoot the way he does. He had the lone goal for the Minnesota Wild, but Detroit stayed neck and neck with them the entire game, and they got offense from a guy that hadn't gotten offense yet this season in Lucas Raymond. He scored both goals in the game, his first 2 of the season, one of which was on a power play, and that's another thing that helped propel them. Is the Red Wings in the game against Boston and New Jersey could not take advantage of chances. They hit 3 posts against Boston. They hit 2 against Minnesota. But Lucas Raymond went out there. He scored his first off a wonderful shot. He scored his second on the power play, going 1 for 3 on the power play. And me and Scotty talk about it on Locked On Red Wings all the time. If this team wants to succeed, they're going to have to convert on their power play opportunities. They didn't do that all last season. So far this year, I think they're 21st in the league. They're getting a lot of opportunities, just struggling to convert, but they're getting better opportunities. And they've now scored power play goals in multiple games, and it looks a lot improved. Their penalty kill was perfect up until the New Jersey game. They let up 3 against Boston. I just want to wipe the one against Boston off the map. Like that was a horrible game from Detroit in a lot of different ways. But they came out in this game, and a lot of the things Scotty and I talked about they needed to improve on, they improved on. They played better defensively. Goaltending showed up. They only committed 2 penalties, which, it's hard to give up power play goals when you take less penalties, right? Like you take less penalties, you get scored on less. And they just looked better overall. You got offense from guys you weren't getting offense from, like Lucas Raymond. So it was just overall a great response from the Detroit Red Wings to snap a 2-game losing skid and just get off on the right foot for what is a tough stretch.
Yeah, tough stretch coming up. How concerned, I know it's still early, we're 8 games into the season, but how concerned are you about the backup goaltending of Alex Nedeljkovic?
Not too worried, to be honest. Last year he was inconsistent for sure. He would go out there. I think he had a 46 shot shutout against the Boston Bruins last year. He looked absolutely great, phenomenal in that game. It was Boston or Carolina. My memory is a little affecting me here, but he had a 46 shot shutout in that game. And then he would have games where he'd let in 3 or 4 off some easy goals. But he's got a lot of potential. He's young yet for a goaltender. He's only 26 years old. And even if he is just a backup, he's a really good backup to have. And that's what this season is kind of trying to figure out. Steve Yzerman in the offseason made the decision he's not completely comfortable with Nedeljkovic as a starter. Went out and treated a 3rd-round pick for Ville Husso. And so far, Ville Husso's looked better. Ville Husso earned his 2nd consecutive start. And I would argue that he probably deserves a 3rd after how well he played against the Wild in the game against Buffalo on Monday. But I'm not really that concerned about it because even if he ends up being a backup, he's still a really good backup to have.
We talked about the overall positive start that Detroit is off to this year. What has been the catalyst for the early season success?
It's a great question. Honestly, new acquisitions. Steve Yzerman went out there and spent a lot of money on cap space this year. I mean, they came in with the most cap space in the league, I believe, or second most cap space in the league, maybe behind the Anaheim Ducks. And he went out and spent a lot of it. They only have $9 million left. They still have to extend Bertuzzi and still have to extend Larkin. Thank God the cap's going up. But they got Kopp, they got Perron, they got Kubalik. They got Ben Sherrod on the back end. They got Mott on the back end, Pysyk on the back end, who's out because he tore his Achilles, unfortunately, right after signing. But those guys, Sans, Pysyk, have been phenomenal. Oli Mata was off to a hot start. He's not an offensive defenseman, but he was getting a lot of points early in the season. He cooled off a little since then. Ben Sherrod's been a great person to pair with Moritz Seider as they just go around and they beat people up in front of the net. It's been fun. And Kubalik and Perron have been scoring so much. Kubalik's the leading scorer on the Detroit Red Wings coming into the Minnesota Wild game. I haven't checked since then, but coming in the Minnesota Wild game, he had 10 points on 7 games. I think it's probably now 10 points in 8 games because he didn't get a point against Minnesota. But he's been scoring at a high rate. David Perron's been scoring at a high rate. And they're a big reason why the power play for the Red Wings is so much better because they both get in their respective circles. You feed them one-timers and they score. And when they play in the same power play, they just both sit in the circles and pass the puck back and forth and shoot the puck. And they've been the new acquisitions for the Detroit Red Wings have been like the key reason why they're producing so much more offense, scoring at such a higher rate than they did last year.
And yet, we talked before we started recording, you had some concerns also as far as what you've seen over the first 8 games. What are the areas that have you the most concerned as far as the long term is concerned?
I mean, my biggest concern is the same as it was last year. Defense. Their defense is on paper much improved, but when you go from the team that gave up the most goals against for 60 from last year, it's not a high bar to step over. You got the acquisitions of Ben Sherratt, you got the acquisition of Oli Mata, and they've been good. But does that make them a great defensive core? No, it doesn't. I mean, Oli Mata was signed to a 1, maybe 2-year deal. I can't remember off the top of my head, but he isn't a long-term solution on that second pairing with Filip Hronek. Ben Sherratt was signed for 4 years, so he is supposed to be a long-term solution. But this defensive core, your third pairing, you're rotating Robert Haig, who is another acquisition for 1 year. You're rotating Osterley and Lindstrom, and that third pairing is kind of weak, to be honest. The second pairing has games where they're on and off. The only consistent pairing so far has been Ben Sherratt and Moritz Seider in terms of, capability on the top pair. They've been a very good top pair so far, but those other 2 pairings have been, like I said, Oli Mata and Filip Hronek have been hot and cold. They played great against Minnesota. They played horrible against Boston. That third pairing is a rotation because they can't figure out what's the best lineup. And once Mark Pysyk gets healthy, I'm sure that'll settle down because Pysyk's a solid defenseman. He's a defensive defenseman, solid depth defenseman, but until he comes back, it's going to be kind of a rotation, a carousel of players back there. And it does worry me because a lot of the times they get torched on the outside, breaking towards the net. It's just, and they struggle to take care of the bodies in front. They are definitely the biggest weakness on the team, better than last year, but again, low bar to step over.
All right, Brian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Well, they can find us anywhere. You can listen to your podcast. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple. We're on the Odyssey app. Obviously, if you're more privy to visuals, we're on YouTube as well. And you can find me at Brian Fisher, WWJ on Twitter. My co-host Scotty, as I combined his first and last names there into Skentley. My co-host Scotty is on Twitter at Bentley Scotty, and our podcast is at LO_Red Wings on Twitter. So we'll be there. We're covering every single game, just like every other show on Locked On. We have a new episode 5 days a week. So stay tuned if you want to listen to some good Red Wings content.
All right, Brian Fisher, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your #1 source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, hockey, and golf. Hey, maybe you've got a feeling about a hot goaltender, or you want to put a little extra something on your favorite team's game to make it more exciting and interesting for you. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet online, where the game starts.